Some are saying that Kevin Warsh is in favor of yield curve control. But what does that mean? The Fed and the Treasury are two separate entities. The Treasury is part of the US government, a function of the executive branch. And they are told essentially what to do by the US government. And they can raise money on behalf of the US by issuing bonds. That's what the Treasury does. But the Fed, on the other hand, is a separate entity. It is a quasi-public institution where some of its power comes from the government, but it's technically owned by banks. And their goal is to keep the economy steady. But when the Fed and the Treasury get cozy with one another, which could be what Kevin Warsh is asking for and calling for, then they can do things that doesn't necessarily serve the goals of a stable economy. We've seen some evidence that the current administration's goal is to correct the debt to GDP by running the economy hot and rapidly increasing the GDP, potentially faster than the growth of the debt. So in order to do this, the administration wants lower interest rates. Lower interest rates encourage investment and GDP growth. Now, once again, if enough of that investment is going into AI, then you can get strong growth in the economy without that necessarily leading to price inflation for the everyday person. But we also have the fact that the US Treasury has to roll over a very large amount of its debt in 2026, something around like $9 trillion, which means that the government needs to borrow money. And if the government is borrowing large amounts of money, especially if they're going to continue to use short-term debt to do it, then that could have an upward pressure on short-term yields. So even if the Fed sets interest rates low, the extreme pressure in the short-term funding markets could still lead to higher interest rates. So some are now questioning whether Kevin Warsh, when talking about creating a new accord between the executive branch, being the Treasury, and the Fed, could he be referring to some form of yield curve control? Yield curve control is when the Treasury and the Fed essentially work together to keep interest rates artificially low. The Fed will buy treasuries to keep rates low, while the Treasury can now issue all of the debt that it needs to issue. But yield curve control essentially means massive money printing. And massive money printing means numbers go up. We're stepping into a completely new paradigm where dollar debasement is not just a trade idea, but instead potentially a monetary standard. And as this is colloquially referred to on sites like X, that means that you probably don't own enough assets.